Hello, everyone. So, in this lecture, we're going to cover one of the current topics that is going on today, which is basically immigration. But we're going to take a spin on it, and we're not going to necessarily cover like the current immigration issues, but we're rather going to compare it with the immigration issues of the 1870s and 1890s to realize that, again, history always repeats itself, right? So, let's get started. And so immigration, the way we know it today, it's very different than the way it worked back in the day, right? So, for example, this idea of an open or closed border did not exist in that same sense. Visas did not exist in the early 1900s or late 1800s. So it is very different. What happened during this time in the United States is basically that they welcomed a lot of immigrants to come to the United States because there was a lot of need for labor, all right? And there was a lot of need for people to come populate the different areas of the United States, right? So, because the Industrial Revolution created a lot of job opportunities for unskilled labor, there wasn't enough people in the U.S. to fill these positions, and so they welcomed people from all over the world to come and fill these jobs. Okay, so as long as you were not sick or did not have a criminal background, you were allowed to come to the US, and basically they had these opportunities for employment, okay, or to come settle in the American West, right? So this is the reason why America welcomed so many people, around 20 million people during the 1870s to the early 1910s, 1920s, right? So it was basically out of need, all right? So it's very different than the way we understand it today. That, for example, we have the closed border and most of the migration comes from the south. Back in the day, most of the migration came from Southeast Europe. And so I think the statistic that gives you a great picture of how the immigration worked back in the day is that at around 1910, about 15% of the American population were not American born, right? These people, most of them were born in other countries, okay? So this basically tells you about how America during this time became the land of opportunity, right? A lot of people coming to the US, and this is when America became kind of sort of like this, like we've always been this land of opportunity, but during this time is when truly people from like the doors were open from people from all over the world to come and take this opportunity to be participant in the American dream. And so when you have so many people pouring into the United States during that time, a lot of interesting debates or conversations start to happen, right? So for example, the idea of who are the people that you really want to bring into the United States, right? Because the most people that came to the US were people that came from Southeast Europe, right? So basically people from places like Italy, like Poland, like Russia, and some people with religions like Catholicism or Judaism, right? So, in general, during this time, these were not necessarily the people that most Americans wanted to bring to the US, all right? They are what they call riff-raff immigration, right? So they're what people call undesirables, right? They're not necessarily the type of immigrants that most of Americans wanted to come contribute here in the United States, basically because they saw them as, you know, with a culture, you know, lesser than theirs, right? So probably something like religion was lesser than theirs too, or not necessarily lesser, but they saw the religions as incompatible with Protestantism, which is the way that most Americans live their lives, right? So Catholicism was considered to be incompatible in a summary kind of sort of because they saw the rituals and the communion and more than anything the idea of the Pope as something kind of sort of like not very kind of like voting well with the American culture. Same thing with Judaism. So most of the people that came from this type of religions were not very well welcome, right? And you also need to think about that some of these people that came from places that spoke different languages, they were not very well welcome either, right? So if you didn't speak English, but you spoke something like Polish or Greek or Italian or some other language that doesn't even resemble, English, you're not very well welcome, right? Because people started forming these assumptions or this, you know, stereotypes about, for example, the Italians or the Jews, have the stereotypes about the mafia or being drunks or being prone to violence. And so there are a couple of political cartoons from the time that I wanted to show you that illustrate this, issues or this preconceived notions that people had about immigrants in that time period. Okay.
All right, so this political cartoon is from the 1890s, and it shows what I mentioned earlier, the idea of riff-raff immigration and the danger to American ideas and institutions by immigrants, right? So if you look at the caption, it says immigration statistics for the past years show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants are now being supplanted by the criminals and outlaws of Europe. And so if you look at some of the people over here, you see, pauper, illiterate, criminal, outlaw, mafia, anarchist. This is basically more or less the preconceived notions that people had from immigrants coming from this particular part of Europe, right? So it also shows you a lot of the concerns that people began to have, and I believe this one is from the 1890s or early 1900s, and it basically begins to show you some of the concerns that a lot of Americans begin to have by having so many people from Europe that we really don't know who these people were. Okay, so this other political cartoon illustrates around the same sentiment that if you notice, they have all these people who are, depicted as rats, and you have, anarchist, mafia, socialist. A lot of these people is basically the preconception again that people had of the immigrants that came from Southeast Europe. And these political cartoons were very popular at the time, right? And as you notice from there, direct from the slums of Europe daily, we had no restrictions on how many people were coming, right? We just basically welcomed everyone. And people were complaining that most of the people that were coming to America were not, necessarily the people that Americans wanted to come here. It was usually people who were poor or who had a lot of problems or different traditions, different cultures. And so a lot of people were not very welcoming of these new immigrants into America. And so this is another one I wanted to show you. This is the very famous, poster of No Irish Need Apply. And so this also talked about once again the prejudice and preconceived notion that people had about Irish, right? So what I gather from this is that it didn't necessarily have to be people who don't speak the same language, because Irish speak English, right? It is basically the stereotypes that people had about Irish, right? That they were drunkards, that they were troublemakers, that there were really people that part of the population did not want them to be here in the United States with them. They don't think they bring anything that was going to be a meaningful contribution to the United States.
And so these newly arriving people to the United States were usually called hyphenated American, meaning Irish hyphen America or Polish hyphen American, so on and so forth, right? So these people were usually not considered full Americans. They were considered kind of sort of half and half. And a lot of people doubted their loyalty to the US. And, these hyphenated Americans are the people who usually suffer from all this prejudice and discrimination. And, the idea of hyphenated Americans is very different than what we see today. So, for example, today, I would be considered Mexican American, but it doesn't mean that I'm a half and half. It just means that I'm an American with Mexican heritage, right? Back in the day, it didn't mean that, right? It meant that you're half and half, and a lot of people were very doubtful of your loyalties, right? Do your loyalties lie with the US, or does it lie with your country of origin, or does it lie with your religion? All right. So, these are the people that, for example, Roosevelt, said that we didn't need any hyphenated Americans. That we really needed were true Americans who, bring something to contribute to the American society. Okay. So, because of all of this, by the 1920s, there's going to be some laws, right, that try to curb migration, to limit immigration from those particular countries in Southeast Europe, right? So This is called the Natural Origins Act, and this is in 1924. Okay, so what what this do is basically put some quotas, right? So the goal was to limit people from specific part of Europe, specifically Southeast Europe, to limit their migration to the US, but open the door more from to people who were from places like Britain, places like Germany, places like Norway, Sweden, place in Scandinavia, right? These were the people that a lot of Americans were more welcoming into the American society. And so all of this brought very interesting conversations that resonate a lot with what we're going on today, right? Because this is a very similar situation. This large influx of immigrants kind of like brings this question about, what does it mean to be American? And, you know, how should these people assimilate into the American culture? So in the 1900s, we had three different schools of thought, and it was basically either Americanization, the melting pot, or cultural pluralism. Okay, so for example, Americanization basically meant that you should almost shed your old skin and become an American, all right? This was a very popular school of thought at the time that if people came to America, they should fully assimilate and become like the people who are here already, all right? So don't bring your culture and try to integrate your culture into the American society, but rather you should become that American side. So, for example, that would mean that immigrants coming to America, they would not have to. There wasn't a law about it, but they were being encouraged to change their name, take citizenship classes, to know about American history, to know George Washington, to know American Revolution, to know civics, to participate in government, to you know to celebrate Thanksgiving, for example, to celebrate Independence Day, to kind of like be fully integrated into this American culture, right? And also, maybe go to those settlement houses and take some of these classes. And very famously, for example, the Ford Motor Company had these classes for their employees because Ford believed that you should be fully integrated into the American culture to be a more productive worker. So the second school of thought was the melting pot. And the melting pot basically meant that you bring your culture and you fuse it with the current American culture, right? So creating something entirely new, right? So it doesn't really mean that you don't do anything American or that you shed your old uh, culture, but rather that you bring your culture, you fuse it with the American culture, and you become something new altogether, right? So, for example, in my city of Laredo, it's very popular that people, talk what we call Spanglish, right? So it's a mixture of English and Spanish. So it's not one thing or the other, but it's actually a fusion of it, all right? So it is interesting because if you go and in different places, in the States or out of a country like this, people are not going to understand you, right? But here in Laredo, people will understand you when you talk like this, right? So that's an example of a melting pot, right? That you bring one culture, you mix it with the other, and create something new, right? So that would mean that for immigrants in the 1920s, that they would come and bring some of their cultures and maybe mix it with the others and become something entirely new. So maybe you learn English but you keep your own language and you make something new out of it all. But it doesn't stop there, right? Because you mix it with all the different cultures from that are here in the US, right? So Italians and Greeks and Americans and British, and they all mix these cultures and become something entirely new. Okay, so this was the other school of thought of like you don't really need to be fully American, right? To be Americanized, right? You can also bring your culture and you can make something new out of all of it. Okay? And the other school of thought was basically the idea of cultural pluralism, right? So cultural pluralism basically meant that you bring your culture but you don't abandon it, right? That keep it, you speak your language, you don't need to fully integrate to the American culture. You keep your old heritage, right? You don't forget where you come from, kind of sort of, right? So you know that would mean that you come here, and in New York, for example, was very popular Little Italy or Chinatown, and in these places, people kept their traditions, and they kept the language, and sometimes they never learned English, and they never, fully assimilated, and they didn't become Protestant. They don't know who's George Washington. They are very up to, who was the president of, their home country at the time, right? So cultural pluralism just basically means that you can keep your old traditions and live in the US and still be loyal to the United States, right? So these were the three different schools of thought of how things went in the 1920s. We had a combination of all of them. Some people were more of a cultural pluralist, particularly if you're an immigrant who comes and you're from an older age. It is more difficult for you to learn a new language or to try to assimilate, right? But the younger generations, are easier for them to either become more of a melting pot or become very Americanized, right? In the sense that you forget your old cultures. So, for example, for us here in my city of Laredo, you start forgetting who, for example, Pedro Infante or Vicente Fernandez, who these people are, and you're more about, George Strait or, whoever these new singers are here, and you integrate, and are more into the things that you see here in the US rather than your culture in your country of origin or the country of your parents. People are very, you know kind of like hesitant to abandon their old cultures and just become something entirely new. So we were supposed to have become a melting pot, but it kind of sort of never melted, all right? We always remain a little bit of our old self, but at the same time, you know, we also kind of embrace some of the American culture. And so, anyways, this is always very interesting because even though these are events that happened in the 1880s, early 1900s, you know, still in the present time, we're still having these conversations because, history repeats itself, right? Even though immigration it's has taken a different form, we have different laws, and we have, different issues. And today, most of the people that are immigrants come from south of the border rather than from somewhere in Europe. But still, we still have the same conversations, right? Of, should we become a single cohesive society, kind of like very Americanized, and demand for everyone that becomes an immigrant to blend and fully assimilate with the American culture, or should we still strive to become the melting pot, or should we allow the idea of cultural pluralism? And this is really a matter of opinion, and this is still a conversation that hundreds, 100 years have gone by, and we're still having this conversation. But I find it very interesting because again, this is another example of history repeating itself, or this has been always kind of like not that it repeats, but it's a very continuous uh, event that the conversation never really ended, right? The thing is that because immigration is such a contentious issue today, people are still having this conversation more like in the present about what should we do with all of this, right? So anyways, this is all I have for you today. Let me know what you think, and if you have any questions, I'll be around, and be safe. Okay, see y'all.